In exactly 4 hours, Bradley Vincent would be begging the man he just insulted to save his life. The words hung in the air like a prophecy waiting to unfold. But right now, in the first-class lounge at Denver International Airport, Bradley Vincent felt like the king of his own universe. Thunder rumbled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows as sheets of rain turned the tarmac into a shimmering mirror of delayed flights and frustrated travelers. But Bradley Vincent didn't do frustrated. Frustrated was for people who flew coach. Frustrated was for the masses huddled around gate monitors, clutching boarding passes for middle seats and praying their zone would be called. Bradley adjusted the platinum cufflinks on his $15,000 Italian suit and checked his Patek Philippe watch. At 48, he carried himself with the aggressive confidence of a man who had spent the last 15 years firing people for sport. Before we dive into this story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this moment of karma makes you believe that the universe has a sense of justice, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. Bradley was the CEO of Vintech Industries, a mid-sized technology consulting firm that he had inherited from his father and ruthlessly expanded through cost-cutting layoffs and what he called efficiency optimization. What others called human misery, Bradley called quarterly profits. He was used to things moving when he snapped his fingers. He was used to people saying, "Yes, sir," and right away, "Mr. Vincent. Mr. Vincent." The lounge attendant, a young Latina woman named Carmen, with a practiced smile, approached his leather armchair tentatively. "We're ready to escort you to the gate now. Pre-boarding is beginning for Flight 847 to London Heathrow." Bradley didn't look up from his laptop where he was reviewing the presentation that would either make or break his company's biggest deal. A $50 million contract with Meridian International depended on him being in London by 9 a.m. tomorrow. He was already 3 hours behind schedule thanks to what he considered the incompetence of modern air travel. About time, Bradley muttered, closing his laptop with a sharp snap. "This weather is a disaster. If we get stuck on the tarmac, heads are going to roll." "The captain is very experienced," Sir Carmen said, trying to be reassuring as she walked him toward the private elevator that would take him directly to the jet bridge. "They're confident about making up time once we're airborne." "I don't care about the captain's confidence." Bradley snapped his voice, carrying the tone of a man who had never been told no. "I care about results. I have a board presentation that's worth more money than you'll see in a lifetime." Carmen's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her professionalism. "I'm sure everything will work out perfectly, Mr. Vincent." Bradley stepped onto the jet bridge before anyone else, breathing in the cooler air that smelled of jet fuel and recycled air conditioning. This was his domain seat 1. The suite with the closing door, the lie-flat bed, and the champagne that was poured before the wheels even left the ground. As he stepped onto the aircraft, the lead flight attendant was there to greet him. Isabella Rodriguez had been flying for Global Sky Airways for 8 years. She had seen it all: drunk celebrities, crying babies, medical emergencies, and every type of entitled passenger imaginable. At 28, she had developed the perfect balance of warmth and authority that kept first-class passengers happy while maintaining order in the cabin. She knew how to handle VIPs, but something about Bradley Vincent set her internal warning system on high alert. "Welcome aboard Flight 847 to London." Mr. Vincent, Isabella said, her voice warm but professional. "Let me take your coat and get you settled in." Bradley handed over his cashmere coat without a word, brushing past her to claim his throne in seat 1A. He immediately pulled out his laptop and phone, beginning to bark orders into his wireless headset, despite the fact that the turn-off electronics announcement hadn't even started yet. "No, tell the Tokyo team that if the shipment isn't there by Monday, they're all fired." Bradley's voice carried through the first-class cabin. "I don't care about their supply chain issues. I don't care about the typhoon. Results are all that matter. Get it done or get out." He hung up and looked around the cabin with the satisfaction of a predator surveying his territory. The first-class section was filling up with his kind of people. a tech entrepreneur in seat 1F who was quietly working on his tablet, a travel blogger in row 3 who was setting up her camera equipment, and an elderly couple in row 4 who looked like retired teachers on the trip of a lifetime. This felt right to Bradley. This was his tribe, his economic ecosystem where money talked and everything else walked. Then the flow of boarding paused for a moment, and something caught his eye that disrupted his sense of natural order. The cockpit door, which usually remained closed during boarding, was standing wide open. The pilots were going through their pre-flight checks, their voices low and professional as they prepared the aircraft for departure. Bradley, having stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment, glanced up and found himself with a clear view through the galley and into the flight deck. He saw the back of the first officer's head. Blonde hair, young-looking, exactly what Bradley expected from his mental image of a competent pilot. But then his eyes shifted to the captain's seat, and what he saw there made his blood pressure spike. The captain was a black man. Captain Marcus Thompson turned slightly in his seat to check something on the overhead panel, giving Bradley a partial view of his profile. He appeared young, maybe early 30s, with an easy confidence as he went through the complex pre-flight procedures. He was laughing at something the first officer had said, his hand resting casually on the throttle quadrant like he had been born to be there. It was a picture of competence and ease, but Bradley didn't see competence. He saw a disruption to his worldview. He saw affirmative action in action. He saw what he was convinced was a diversity hire sitting in the most critical seat on the aircraft. He saw a threat to his safety, his schedule, and his very profitable future. Bradley's mind immediately went to the places it always went when he encountered people who didn't fit his narrow definition of merit. He thought about quotas and political correctness, and what he called the lowering of standards to make certain people feel better about themselves. He thought about the statistics he had read on questionable websites about differences in reaction times and cognitive processing. He thought about his own superiority and his right as a paying customer who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars annually on business travel to demand the best. Bradley pressed the call button. He didn't just press it once. He mashed it repeatedly the way someone might pound on a door during an emergency. Isabella appeared at his seat within seconds, her professional smile already in place. "Yes, Mr.
Vincent. Can I get you some champagne?"
"No." Bradley hissed, his voice low but vibrating with barely controlled agitation. He pointed a manicured finger toward the open cockpit door. "Is that our pilot?" Isabella looked confused for a moment, following his gaze to the flight deck where Captain Thompson was now reviewing the flight plan with his first officer. "Yes, sir. That's Captain Thompson. He's one of our most senior pilots, and I don't care about his seniority." Bradley interrupted, his voice getting louder and drawing the attention of the tech entrepreneur across the aisle. "I want to see the manifest. I want to know who exactly is flying this plane and what their qualifications are." Isabella's professional mask slipped slightly as she processed what was happening. In 8 years of flying, she had dealt with drunk passengers, medical emergencies, and every type of difficult customer imaginable. But blatant, undisguised racism in the first-class cabin was something that still had the power to shock her. "Sir, I can assure you that Captain Thompson is fully qualified and certified by the Federal Aviation Administration. He has an impeccable safety record, and I don't trust black pilots," Bradley said. He didn't whisper it. He didn't say it with shame or embarrassment. He said it with the matter-of-fact arrogance of a man ordering a specific vintage of wine. The words hung in the first-class cabin like a toxic cloud poisoning the air and creating an immediate silence that felt heavy and dangerous. Isabella's face went pale, her professional composure cracking like a dam under pressure. "Excuse me, sir. You heard me," Bradley said, leaning back in his seat and crossing his legs with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his words. "They push them through the academy to fill quotas. I know how this works. I've been in corporate America long enough to understand how diversity initiatives compromise standards. I'm not risking my life because your airline wants to look inclusive in their marketing materials. The tech entrepreneur in seat 1F slowly removed his headphones, staring at Bradley with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. The travel blogger in row 3 had already quietly started recording her phone, positioned to catch every word. The elderly couple in row 4 exchanged looks of shock and concern, their faces reflecting the horror that everyone else in the cabin was feeling. Isabella Rodriguez straightened her spine, every inch of her 5 feet 6 inches frame radiating authority. In 8 years of flying, she had been grabbed, cursed at, and vomited on. She had dealt with drunks who tried to open airplane doors at 35,000 feet, and celebrities who thought their fame exempted them from basic human decency. But sitting in front of her was something that pushed her past the limits of professional tolerance. Mr. Vincent, Isabella said, her voice dropping to a steel-edged whisper that somehow carried more authority than shouting. Captain Thompson has been flying commercial aircraft for over a decade. Before that, he was a military pilot with an exemplary record. He is more than qualified to safely operate this aircraft. Bradley laughed, a dry, barking sound that made everyone in the vicinity uncomfortable. Save the resume, sweetheart. I know a diversity hire when I see one. You think I got to where I am today by being naive about how the world works. I run a $500 million company. I know about standards, real standards, not the politically correct version that gets people killed. He stood up from his seat, his 6-foot 2-inch frame imposing in the narrow confines of the aircraft cabin. Bradley Vincent had learned long ago that physical intimidation was often more effective than logical argument, and he wasn't above using his size to make his point. He stepped into the aisle, blocking the path of other passengers who were trying to find their seats. I want to speak to the gate agent, Bradley demanded, his voice now loud enough to carry into the business class section. Get them down here right now. I want off this plane or I want a different pilot. Those are my options. Isabella raised her hand in a firm stop signal, her years of training kicking in. Sir, please return to your seat. We are in the middle of boarding and you are blocking the aisle. I'm not sitting down until I speak to someone with actual authority. Bradley sneered, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Not some flight attendant who's probably just as much of a diversity hire as the pilot. Inside the cockpit, the commotion had finally registered with the flight crew. First Officer David Martinez, a 29-year-old pilot with blonde hair and 5 years of commercial flying experience, frowned as he heard the raised voices coming from the cabin. Marcus. You hear that? David asked, adjusting his headset and looking toward the cabin door. Captain Marcus Thompson finished entering the navigation coordinates into the flight management computer. He didn't look up immediately, but his jaw tightened slightly. Marcus had hearing like a radar operator, a skill developed during his years as a Navy pilot. He had heard not just the tone, but most of the specific words, and they sounded unfortunately familiar. I heard it, Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying the steady authority of someone who had dealt with far worse situations than an angry passenger in first class. Do you want me to call security? David asked, his hand hovering over the interphone. We can have him removed. Airport police are right at the gate. Marcus turned his chair around and looked at his first officer. Marcus had kind eyes, but they were tired in a way that spoke of years of dealing with people like Bradley Vincent. He had flown F/A-18 Super Hornets off aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf. He had trained elite Navy pilots in advanced combat maneuvers. He had earned the respect of some of the most demanding commanding officers in the military. A loudmouth in an expensive suit was annoying, not threatening. Let's not escalate just yet, Marcus said, unbuckling his harness. We're already 90 minutes behind schedule because of the weather. If we pull him off, we have to pull his bags, reschedule passengers, file paperwork. That's a 3-hour delay minimum, and these people just want to get to London. But Marcus, I know what he said. David. Marcus interrupted gently. And I appreciate you having my back. but I've been dealing with guys like this my whole career. Sometimes the best response is showing them exactly who they're talking to. Marcus stood up and straightened his uniform jacket. There was something transformative that happened when he put on the captain's hat with its gold braiding. It turned him from a man into an institution, a symbol of authority and competence that even the most prejudiced passenger had to acknowledge. "Let me handle this," Marcus said, opening the cockpit door and stepping into the cabin. The sight of the captain entering the passenger area created an immediate hush throughout the forward section of the aircraft. Marcus stood 6 feet 1 inch with broad shoulders and a presence that seemed to fill the entire cabin. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing confident without being arrogant, and his expression calm but alert. He nodded to Isabella, giving her a subtle signal of support, and then turned his attention to Bradley Vincent, who was still standing in the aisle with his arms crossed and his face red with indignation. "Good afternoon, Marcus," said his voice, a deep baritone that carried easily through the cabin. "I understand there's been some concern about the flight. Is there something I can help you with?" Bradley puffed out his chest, looking Marcus up and down with undisguised skepticism. This was the moment he had been waiting for, his chance to assert his authority and demand the respect he felt was owed to him as a first-class passenger and successful businessman. "Yeah, there's a problem," Bradley said, his voice carrying clearly to every passenger in the first-class and business-class sections. "I was just explaining to your stewardess here that I'm not comfortable with you flying this aircraft." Marcus didn't blink. He didn't get angry. He didn't show any emotion at all except a kind of clinical curiosity, like a scientist observing an interesting but predictable phenomenon. "May I ask why you're not comfortable?" Marcus asked, his tone remaining perfectly professional. The question hung in the air for a moment as Bradley realized that his moment of truth had arrived. He could back down, make some excuse about wanting to check credentials, and return to his seat with his prejudices intact but unexpressed. Or he could double down, say what he really meant, and face whatever consequences came from speaking his truth in front of a cabin full of witnesses. Bradley Vincent had not become the CEO of a major corporation by backing down from confrontations. "Because I don't believe you're qualified," Bradley said loudly enough for passengers 6 rows back to hear him clearly. "I think you're a quota filler and I'm a paying customer who demands the best. I have every right to know that my life is in competent hands." A collective gasp went through the cabin like a wave. Sarah Chen, the travel blogger, in row 3, quietly adjusted her phone to make sure she was getting every word of the exchange. James Mitchell, the tech entrepreneur in seat 1F, started typing rapidly on his phone, documenting what he was witnessing in real time. Robert and Linda Hayes, the retired teachers in row 4, looked at each other with expressions of horror and disbelief. Marcus Thompson smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had heard these words before, who had developed strategies for dealing with this exact situation, and who was about to demonstrate why prejudice is not just morally wrong, but also intellectually foolish. Sir Marcus said, his voice carrying to the back of the business class section. "I appreciate your concern for safety. That's always the top priority on any flight. Can I ask what specific qualifications you'd like to discuss?" The challenge in Marcus's voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Bradley Vincent found himself in the position of having to defend his prejudices with facts he didn't possess in front of an audience he hadn't expected, against a man whose calm competence was already making him look foolish. But Bradley had not built a multi-million-dollar company by backing down when challenged. If anything, resistance only made him more aggressive, more determined to prove that his instincts about people were correct, and that his success in business qualified him to judge everyone around him. "Listen," Bradley said, stepping closer to Marcus in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating move. "I've been flying first class for 20 years. I've seen how these diversity programs work. Airlines are under pressure to hire people who look good in their promotional materials rather than people who can actually do the job." Isabella Rodriguez watched the confrontation with growing alarm. As the senior flight attendant, she had the authority to remove disruptive passengers, but she also knew that escalating the situation could create bigger problems. More importantly, she had worked with Captain Thompson on dozens of flights and knew exactly what kind of pilot he was. What Bradley Vincent was about to discover was that his assumptions weren't just wrong, they were spectacularly wrong. Mr. Vincent, Isabella interjected, trying to provide a bridge to de-escalation. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable if Captain Thompson shared some of his background with you. I don't need a diversity lecture, Bradley snapped, never taking his eyes off Marcus. I need to know that whoever is flying this plane earned their position through merit, not politics. James Mitchell, the tech entrepreneur who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. Dude, maybe you should just sit down and let the man do his job. You're holding up the entire flight. Bradley wheeled around to face James, his anger now finding a new target. Excuse me, I don't remember asking for your opinion. I'm protecting all of us by asking legitimate questions about safety. You're not asking questions about safety, James replied, his voice calm but firm. You're making assumptions based on race, and it's disgusting. This isn't about race, Bradley shot back, though. Everyone in the cabin could hear the lie in his voice. This is about standards. This is about qualifications. I've built a $500 million company by learning to judge talent, and I'm telling you that someone this young with this background shouldn't be in that cockpit. Sarah Chen, the travel blogger who had been discreetly filming the entire exchange, decided to speak up. Sir, with all due respect, what background are you referring to? You haven't asked about his training or experience. You just saw him and made an assumption. Bradley's face was turning a deeper shade of red as he realized that the entire first-class cabin was now aligned against him. But rather than recognizing that his position might be wrong, he doubled down on his conviction that he was the victim of political correctness, run amok. Fine, Bradley said, crossing his arms and staring directly at Marcus. Let's hear it. Tell me about your qualifications. Tell me about your training. Convince me that you're not just another checkbox hire. Marcus Thompson had been waiting for this moment. In his 12 years of commercial flying, he had encountered versions of Bradley Vincent before. Passengers who looked at his age, his race, or both, and decided that he couldn't possibly have earned his position through merit. What they never expected was to discover exactly what kind of background he actually had. Mr. Vincent, Marcus said, his voice remaining perfectly calm and professional. I appreciate your concern for flight safety. It's actually refreshing to meet a passenger who takes these things seriously. The tone was so free of sarcasm or defensiveness that it caught Bradley off guard. He had expected anger, defensiveness, or intimidation. Instead, he was getting what sounded like genuine appreciation for his concerns. I graduated from the United States Naval Academy. Marcus continued, his voice carrying easily through the cabin. I was commissioned as a naval aviator and flew F/A-18 Super Hornets for 8 years, including 3 combat deployments in the Persian Gulf. A murmur went through the cabin as passengers processed this information. This wasn't the background of a diversity hire or someone who had been pushed through training to fill quotas. This was the resume of someone who had been tested under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. After my military service, Marcus continued, I was selected for the Navy's elite demonstration squadron, the Blue Angels. I spent 2 years flying precision aerobatics and training the Navy's top pilots in advanced flight techniques. Sarah Chen's phone captured the exact moment when Bradley's expression began to change from confident skepticism to something that looked more like concern. James Mitchell was typing rapidly on his phone, documenting what was clearly going to be an epic takedown. Robert and Linda Hayes were watching with the fascination of people witnessing a masterclass in grace under pressure. When I transitioned to commercial aviation, Marcus went on, I completed training on 7 different aircraft types. I'm currently a check airman for Global Sky Airways, which means I'm the pilot who trains and evaluates other pilots, including the white ones. Someone in the business class section actually chuckled at that line, and Bradley could feel the mood in the cabin shifting against him. but his ego was too invested in his position to allow him to back down gracefully. "Military experience is different from commercial flying," Bradley said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This is a 777, not a fighter jet. Civilian passengers, not military cargo." "You're absolutely right," Marcus agreed, nodding thoughtfully. "Flying civilians requires different skills than military flying. It requires patience, communication, and the ability to remain calm under pressure while ensuring the comfort and safety of people who have put their trust in you." The subtext was clear to everyone in the cabin. Marcus was demonstrating all of those skills right now, while Bradley was demonstrating the opposite. "I've logged over 15,000 flight hours," Marcus continued, including emergency situations that would challenge any pilot. "I've landed aircraft with engine failures, hydraulic problems, and severe weather conditions. My safety record is perfect, and my passenger satisfaction ratings are among the highest in the company." Isabella Rodriguez couldn't help but smile slightly as she watched Bradley Vincent's position crumble in real time. She had flown with Marcus Thompson dozens of times and had seen him handle emergencies with a calm competence that made other pilots look like amateurs. What Bradley was discovering was that his assumptions had led him to challenge one of the most qualified pilots in commercial aviation. "But here's what matters most," Marcus said, looking directly at Bradley with an expression of genuine sincerity. "Every passenger on this aircraft, regardless of their race, their background, or their opinions about me, is my responsibility. My job is to get you safely from Denver to London, and I take that responsibility seriously." Now Marcus continued, his voice taking on a subtle edge of authority. "You have a choice to make, Mr. Vincent. You can take your seat trust in my training and experience and enjoy the flight. Or you can gather your belongings and take a different flight. But if you choose to leave, you should know that you won't be flying with Global Sky Airways again anytime soon." The ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge. Bradley looked around the cabin and saw faces staring at him with mixtures of disgust, pity, and curiosity. He saw phones recording his humiliation. He saw the crew waiting for his decision. He saw his own prejudices exposed and challenged in front of an audience that was clearly siding with the pilot he had tried to discredit. The smart move would have been to apologize, return to his seat, and hope the incident would be forgotten. The wise move would have been to recognize that he had been wrong both factually and morally, and to use this as an opportunity for personal growth. But Bradley Vincent was neither smart nor wise in that moment. He was angry, humiliated, and too proud to admit error. "Fine," Bradley said through gritted teeth. "I'll stay, but mark my words. If this flight is anything less than perfect, I'm filing complaints with the FAA, your CEO, and anyone else who will listen. I have connections in this industry, and I know how to make problems for people who don't deliver. I look forward to earning your confidence," Marcus said with a slight smile that somehow managed to be both gracious and condescending at the same time. "Please return to your seat so we can complete our pre-flight preparations." Marcus turned and walked back toward the cockpit, his bearing confident and professional. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, leaving Bradley standing in the aisle feeling like he had just been thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone he had underestimated. Isabella Rodriguez stepped up to Bradley with an expression that was professionally neutral but privately satisfied. "Mr. Vincent, please return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt. We'll be departing shortly." Bradley slumped into seat 1A, his expensive suit suddenly feeling less like armor and more like costume. He was furious, not just with Marcus Thompson, but with everyone in the cabin who had witnessed his humiliation. He pulled out his phone and began typing an angry email to his executive assistant, demanding that she draft complaints to Global Sky Airways, the FAA, and anyone else he could think of. "Hostile crew," he typed. "Reverse racism. Inadequate response to legitimate safety concerns. Discrimination against paying customers." Sarah Chen, still filming discreetly from row 3, added a caption to her footage. Racist passenger tries to get black pilot kicked off flight. Wait until you see what happens next. But she didn't post it yet. Something told her that the story wasn't over. James Mitchell, the tech entrepreneur, turned to his seatmate and whispered, "That guy just challenged a Blue Angels pilot. Does he have any idea how elite that program is?" Robert Hayes? The retired teacher leaned over to his wife Linda and said quietly, "I've been teaching for 40 years, and I've never seen someone humiliate themselves so thoroughly in public." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and the engines wound up to their distinctive whine, Bradley Vincent stared out the window at the rain-soaked tarmac of Denver International Airport. His anger was simmering just below the surface, fueled by embarrassment and a stubborn refusal to accept that he might have been wrong. He had no idea that in less than 3 hours the man he had just insulted would be the only thing standing between him and a fiery death over the North Atlantic. He had no idea that his assumptions about competence and qualifications were about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. He had no idea that the universe was about to teach him a lesson about judging people that he would never forget. The takeoff was flawlessly smooth, which only increased Bradley's irritation. He had been hoping for some minor problem, some small error, that would validate his concerns and prove that his instincts about people were correct. Instead, the aircraft lifted off the runway like it was weightless, climbing through the turbulent weather with the kind of precision that spoke of exceptional skill. As they leveled off at cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign turned off, Bradley ordered his first scotch of the flight and began planning his revenge. He would write scathing reviews. He would contact his connections in the airline industry. He would make sure that Marcus Thompson's inappropriate attitude toward paying customers was documented and reported. He had absolutely no idea that in just a few hours he would be praying for that same pilot to save his life. 2 hours into the flight, Bradley Vincent was on his 4th scotch, and his anger had fermented into something uglier and more toxic. The smooth flight was only making him more bitter. Every minute of perfect flying felt like a personal insult, evidence that the universe was conspiring to make him look foolish. The first-class cabin had settled into the quiet routine of long-haul travel. James Mitchell was working on his laptop, occasionally glancing at Bradley with obvious distaste. Sarah Chen was editing her footage from the earlier confrontation, adding context and commentary for her social media followers. Robert and Linda Hayes were sharing a book and holding hands like teenagers, their obvious affection for each other creating a warm spot in the cabin that Bradley's negativity couldn't quite poison. Isabella Rodriguez was going through her standard service routine, but she was keeping a close eye on Bradley. In her 8 years of flying, she had developed an instinct for passengers who might become problems, and everything about Bradley's body language screamed potential trouble. He was drinking too much, typing aggressively on his phone and muttering under his breath in a way that suggested his anger was building rather than subsiding. Another scotch. Mr. Vincent, Isabella asked, approaching his seat with professional caution. "Make it a double." Bradley slurred slightly, though he was nowhere near drunk. "And warm up those nuts. They were cold last time." Isabella noticed that his laptop screen was displaying a half-written email with the subject line, "Formal complaint. Captain Thompson. Hostile treatment of first-class passenger." She could see fragments of accusations about reverse racism, inadequate training, and demands for disciplinary action. "Of course," Sir Isabella replied, making a mental note to alert the captain about Bradley's escalating behavior. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" Bradley looked up from his laptop with bloodshot eyes that held too much alcohol and too much resentment. "Yeah, you can tell your diversity hire up front that this isn't over. I have connections at the FAA. I know people on the board of directors. That little stunt he pulled earlier was career suicide." Isabella's professional smile faltered slightly. Sir Captain Thompson was nothing but professional and courteous. "If you have concerns about professional," Bradley laughed, a harsh sound that carried through the quiet cabin. He embarrassed a paying customer in front of everyone. That's not professional. That's someone with a chip on his shoulder who thinks his uniform makes him untouchable. James Mitchell looked up from his laptop, his expression showing the kind of disgust reserved for people who embarrass themselves in public. Dude, seriously, you're still going on about this? The man has better credentials than most commercial pilots will ever have. Oh, here we go, Bradley said, turning in his seat to face James directly. Let me guess. You're one of those white guilt liberals who thinks questioning someone's qualifications is automatically racist. I think calling someone unqualified based solely on their race is pretty much the definition of racist. James, replied his voice calm but firm. And I think doubling down on it after being proven completely wrong makes you look pathetic. Bradley's face flushed red, the alcohol and anger combining to strip away what little filter he might have had. Listen, you, Silicon Valley snowflake. I've been running companies since before you learned to code. I know how to evaluate talent. I know the difference between real qualifications and diversity theater. Diversity theater? Sarah Chen's voice cut through the conversation like a knife. She had stopped editing her video and was now openly recording the conversation with her phone. Are you seriously calling the Blue Angels diversity theater? I'm calling affirmative action? What it is, Bradley shot back, his voice rising loud enough to draw attention from the business class section. A feel-good program that puts politics ahead of competence. You think the Navy is immune to political pressure? You think they don't have quotas to fill? Robert Hayes, the retired teacher, finally spoke up from row 4. Son, I taught high school for 40 years. I've seen real prejudice, and I've seen real merit. What you're displaying right now isn't skepticism about qualifications. It's just old-fashioned bigotry dressed up in business language. Don't lecture me, old man. Bradley snarled, standing up unsteadily and swaying slightly in the aisle. I built a $500 million company. I employ 1,200 people. I know more about evaluating talent than some retired teacher who probably spent his career lowering standards to make everyone feel special. Linda Hayes gasped audibly at the insult to her husband, and the cabin atmosphere shifted from uncomfortable to genuinely tense. Isabella realized that the situation was escalating beyond her ability to manage diplomatically. Mr. Vincent, Isabella said firmly, I need you to return to your seat and lower your voice. You're disturbing other passengers. I'm disturbing them, Bradley laughed bitterly. I'm not the one who put an affirmative action hire in the cockpit of a $300 million aircraft. I'm not the one gambling with people's lives to make a political statement. The cabin had gone completely silent now, with every passenger watching the confrontation unfold. Several people had their phones out recording what was clearly going to become a viral video. Bradley was too drunk and too angry to realize that he was creating permanent documentation of his bigotry. That's enough, James Mitchell said, standing up and stepping into the aisle. You need to stop talking before you embarrass yourself any more than you already have. Embarrass myself, Bradley stepped closer to James, using his height advantage in an attempt to intimidate. I'm protecting everyone on this plane by asking legitimate questions. You want to know what's embarrassing. What's embarrassing is passengers who are too politically correct to admit when their safety is being compromised. Our safety isn't being compromised, Sarah Chen said, her phone still recording. But our comfort sure is. You're acting like a drunk racist and everyone here can see it. Drunk racist. Bradley's voice rose to a near shout. I'll show you, drunk racist, you little... He was interrupted by the cockpit door opening with a hydraulic hiss. Captain Marcus Thompson stepped into the cabin, his expression serious but calm. He had been monitoring the cabin audio and had heard enough to know that the situation required immediate attention. The sight of the captain emerging from the cockpit created instant silence. Marcus's presence filled the cabin with authority, and his uniform reminded everyone that they were on his aircraft operating under his command. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Marcus said, his voice carrying easily through the cabin. "I apologize for the disruption. Mr. Vincent, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Bradley swayed slightly as he turned to face Marcus, his alcohol-fogged brain struggling to process the situation. He had been expecting flight attendants to handle his complaints, not the pilot himself. The direct confrontation with the man he had been insulting caught him off guard. "Yeah, let's talk," Bradley said, his words slightly slurred but his anger still burning bright. "Let's talk about professional standards and customer service, and what happens when airlines prioritize politics over competence." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Bradley could hear him clearly. "Mr. Vincent, you're intoxicated and disruptive. Federal aviation regulations give me the authority to have you restrained and arrested when we land. Is that really how you want this to end?" Bradley's eyes widened as he realized that the pilot wasn't just making empty threats. Federal law gave aircraft commanders near absolute authority over their passengers, and disruptive behavior could result in serious criminal charges. "You can't threaten me," Bradley said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I'm a paying customer. I have rights. You have the right to remain quiet and return to your seat." Marcus replied, his tone perfectly professional, but with an unmistakable edge of steel. "You do not have the right to insult other passengers, intimidate crew members, or disrupt the operation of this aircraft." "I wasn't disrupting anything," Bradley protested. "I was having a conversation with fellow passengers about the declining standards in commercial aviation." "You called a decorated naval aviator an affirmative action hire," Marcus said quietly. "You insulted a retired teacher who served his community for 40 years. You've consumed enough alcohol to impair your judgment, and you're currently standing in the aisle preventing normal cabin operations." Bradley looked around the cabin and realized that everyone was staring at him, not with sympathy or support, but with disgust and embarrassment. His attempt to rally passenger support against what he saw as political correctness had backfired spectacularly. "This is discrimination," Bradley said, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is retaliation for asking legitimate questions about safety and qualifications. This is consequences," Marcus replied calmly. "You have two choices, Mr. Vincent. You can return to your seat, finish your flight quietly, and deal with this matter on the ground. Or I can have you restrained right now and hand you over to federal marshals when we land." "What's it going to be?" Bradley Vincent found himself facing the most important decision of his adult life. His ego demanded that he continue fighting, that he double down on his position, and refuse to be intimidated by what he still considered political correctness run amok. But his business instincts, honed by years of corporate survival, told him that he was in a losing position, and that further escalation would only make things worse. "Fine," Bradley muttered, swaying slightly as he turned back toward his seat. "But this isn't over. I have lawyers. I have connections. You people have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Marcus said quietly, just loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "And so does everyone else on this aircraft." Bradley slumped into seat 1A, his expensive suit rumpled and his face flushed with alcohol and humiliation. He stared out the window at the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean below them, his mind churning with resentment and plans for revenge. Isabella Rodriguez approached Marcus as he prepared to return to the cockpit. "How do you want to handle the rest of the flight?" she asked quietly. "Monitor him closely," Marcus replied. "No more alcohol. If he gets disruptive again, we'll consider diverting to Gander or Shannon for removal. Document everything for the report." As Marcus returned to the cockpit, the cabin began to return to its normal rhythm. But the tension remained crackling beneath the surface like electricity before a storm. Bradley continued typing on his laptop, composing increasingly threatening emails to airline executives, FAA officials, and anyone else he thought might help him get revenge against the pilot who had humiliated him. James Mitchell leaned across the aisle toward Sarah Chen. "Are you going to post that video?" he asked quietly. "Not yet," Sarah replied, glancing toward Bradley's seat. "Something tells me this story isn't finished." She was right. Neither Bradley nor Marcus nor anyone else in the cabin had any idea that in less than an hour their conflict would become irrelevant in the face of a crisis that would test everyone's character in ways they couldn't imagine. Bradley Vincent sat in his first-class seat, sipping what Isabella had reluctantly served as his final drink of the flight, and plotting his revenge against Captain Marcus Thompson. He was composing emails to the airline's board of directors, outlining his concerns about declining professional standards and hostile treatment of premium customers. He was researching FAA complaint procedures and federal aviation regulations that he thought might support his position. What he wasn't doing was paying attention to the subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior, the slight variations in engine sound and cabin pressure that might have warned him that his problems with the pilot were about to become the least of his concerns. Marcus Thompson sat in the captain's seat, monitoring weather radar and conducting routine communications with air traffic control. He was focused on the technical aspects of flying a wide-body aircraft across the Atlantic, managing fuel consumption and navigation waypoints, and all the hundreds of small details that keep modern aviation safe and efficient. What he couldn't see from his position in the cockpit was the massive storm approaching ahead of them, or the mechanical problem that was already beginning to manifest in the aircraft's hydraulic operations, or the series of coincidences and equipment failures that would soon turn a routine flight into a test of skills that few pilots would be qualified to handle. In exactly 47 minutes, Bradley Vincent's assumptions about competence and qualification would be put to the ultimate test. In exactly 47 minutes, everyone on Flight 847 would discover what real expertise looked like under pressure. In exactly 47 minutes, Bradley Vincent would begin learning the hardest lesson of his adult life. The first sign of trouble was so subtle that only the most experienced passengers would have noticed it. A slight change in the engine pitch barely perceptible above the normal sounds of the cabin. A minor vibration through the airframe that could have been attributed to turbulence. A brief flicker in the cabin lighting that passengers might have dismissed as normal electrical variation. Bradley Vincent noticed none of these things. He was deep into his fifth scotch, and his third draft of a complaint letter to the airline's board of directors, his anger having fermented into a toxic mixture of alcohol and wounded pride. His laptop screen displayed a document titled Formal Safety Complaint, Unprofessional Conduct by Captain Thompson. Discrimination against Premium Passengers. Isabella Bradley called out his voice, carrying the entitled tone of someone who had never been told no. "I need you to document my treatment on this flight. I want names, times, everything." This pilot's behavior was completely unacceptable. Isabella Rodriguez was refilling water glasses in the galley, but she was also monitoring the subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior that her 8 years of flying experience had trained her to notice. Something felt different, though she couldn't quite identify what. "Mr. Vincent, I've documented everything according to standard procedures," Isabella replied diplomatically. "If you'd like to file a formal complaint, you can do so through the airline's customer service department when we land." "Customer service?" Bradley laughed bitterly. "You think customer service is going to handle what happened here? I'm talking about federal discrimination complaints, FAA violations, corporate liability issues. Your diversity hire pilot threatened a paying customer." James Mitchell looked up from his laptop, his face showing the kind of weary disgust reserved for people who refuse to recognize when they've lost an argument. "Dude, give it a rest. The man's qualified, you were wrong, and everyone here witnessed you making a fool of yourself." "Making a fool of myself?" Bradley's voice rose, drawing attention from other passengers. "I was protecting everyone on this aircraft by asking legitimate questions about competence and safety. Just because you're all too politically correct to..." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden jolt that threw Bradley sideways in his seat. It wasn't the gentle bump of normal turbulence. It was a sharp, violent movement that sent drink glasses sliding across tables and made several passengers gasp audibly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thompson." Marcus's voice came over the intercom calm, but with a new edge of authority. "We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and ensure your seat belts are securely fastened. Flight attendants, please suspend cabin service and take your seats immediately." Isabella immediately moved to her jump seat, her professional training overriding everything else. She had heard that tone before, the carefully controlled voice of a pilot who was dealing with something more serious than routine turbulence. "See," Bradley said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence as another sharp jolt shook the aircraft. "I told you something was wrong. This is exactly what I was talking about. Someone that young doesn't have the experience to his complaint was cut off by a violent drop that made everyone's stomach hit their throat. The aircraft fell for what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, during which several passengers screamed, and even James Mitchell grabbed his armrests with white knuckles. Bradley's scotch glass flew off his table and shattered against the window, sending amber liquid and crystal fragments across his expensive suit. But he barely noticed the mess because something much more frightening was happening. For the first time in years, he felt completely out of control. "What's happening?" Sarah Chen asked, her travel blogger's curiosity warring with genuine fear as she gripped her phone. "This doesn't feel like normal turbulence." Before anyone could answer, the aircraft dropped again, this time with a sickening twist that threw passengers against their restraints. The cabin lights flickered more noticeably now, and from somewhere in the aircraft came a grinding sound that definitely wasn't normal. In the cockpit, Marcus Thompson was facing a pilot's worst nightmare. Multiple system failures occurring simultaneously. The hydraulic system that controlled the aircraft's flight surfaces was losing pressure rapidly. The weather radar was showing a massive storm system ahead that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. And most critically, the number 2 engine was showing signs of serious distress. "David talked to me about the hydraulic readouts," Marcus said to his first officer, his voice calm despite the crisis developing around them. First Officer David Martinez was scanning the instrument panel with the focused intensity of someone whose training was taking over from his fear. "Hydraulic system pressure dropping rapidly. We've lost about 40% in the last 2 minutes. Number 2 engine is showing irregular temperature readings." "Get me a vector around this weather," Marcus commanded, his hands fighting the increasingly unresponsive controls, "and prep the emergency checklist for hydraulic failure." The aircraft lurched again more violently this time, and the grinding sound grew louder and more ominous. In the cabin, passengers who had been worried were now becoming genuinely frightened. Bradley Vincent, who had spent the last hour criticizing Marcus Thompson's qualifications, was now faced with the terrifying reality that his life depended entirely on the skills of the man he had been trying to get fired. "This is his fault," Bradley said, though his voice was shaking and lacked its earlier conviction. "I told you he wasn't experienced enough. Young pilots don't know how to handle situations like this." "Shut up," James Mitchell snapped, his patience finally exhausted. "Just shut up and let the professionals do their job." The intercom crackled to life again, and Marcus's voice filled the cabin with a calm authority that was somehow more reassuring than any amount of reassurance. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thompson. We are experiencing a hydraulic system malfunction and have made the decision to divert to Gander, Newfoundland. This is a precautionary measure to ensure everyone's safety. We anticipate landing in approximately 90 minutes. Flight attendants will be coming through the cabin to prepare for an emergency landing procedure." Emergency landing procedure. The words hit every passenger like a physical blow, transforming worry into genuine fear. This wasn't turbulence or minor mechanical issues. This was the kind of situation that made the evening news. Bradley Vincent felt his world tilting in a way that had nothing to do with the aircraft's erratic movements. For the first time in his adult life, his money, his status, his corporate authority meant absolutely nothing. He was just another passenger in a metal tube that might or might not make it to the ground safely. "Oh, God," Sarah Chen whispered, her phone forgotten, as the reality of the situation sank in. "This is really happening." Robert Hayes reached over and took his wife Linda's hand, their 60-year marriage, providing them with the kind of strength that couldn't be purchased or earned through corporate success. "It's going to be okay," he told her quietly. "We have a good pilot." "A good pilot?" Bradley's voice cracked slightly. "How do you know? How does anyone know? This is exactly what I was worried about." Because Isabella Rodriguez said firmly, looking directly at Bradley from her jump seat, "Captain Thompson has successfully handled 3 emergency landings in his career, including a bird strike that took out both engines over Phoenix 2 years ago. He landed that aircraft safely with everyone aboard." "How do you know that?" Bradley asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "Because I was on that flight," Isabella replied. "And because, unlike you, I don't make assumptions about people's qualifications based on what they look like." The aircraft shuddered again, and this time the grinding sound was accompanied by a loud bang from somewhere behind them. Several passengers screamed, and even Bradley felt his carefully constructed confidence crumbling completely. Marcus's voice came over the intercom again, still calm but with an urgency that couldn't be hidden. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have lost our number 2 engine. This is a serious but manageable situation. Aircraft are designed to fly safely on one engine, and we are proceeding to Gander for an emergency landing. Please listen carefully to your flight attendants and follow all instructions exactly as given." Lost an engine. The words echoed through the cabin like a death sentence. Bradley Vincent, who had built his entire identity around being in control, found himself facing the ultimate loss of control. He was 35,000 feet above the North Atlantic Ocean in a damaged aircraft, completely dependent on the competence of the man he had spent the day insulting and trying to get fired. "This can't be happening," Bradley muttered, his hands shaking as he gripped his armrests. "This can't be happening." "It is happening," James Mitchell said grimly, looking out the window at the wing, where they could see pieces of the engine cowling missing and irregular flames coming from what remained of the number 2 engine. "And you better pray that pilot is as good as he says he is." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of terror emergency procedures and increasingly desperate conditions. The weather ahead of them continued to deteriorate, forcing Marcus to navigate around massive storm cells while flying a damaged aircraft on one engine. The hydraulic system continued to fail, making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. Isabella and the other flight attendants went through the cabin, demonstrating the brace position and ensuring that everyone understood the emergency procedures. They spoke with calm professionalism, but every experienced flyer could see the concern in their eyes. In the event of an emergency landing, Isabella explained to the first-class passengers, "You will hear the command. Brace, brace, brace from the cockpit. When you hear that command, immediately assume the position I'm showing you now. Head down, hands behind your head, feet flat on the floor." Bradley Vincent tried to focus on the instructions, but his mind was racing with panic and self-recrimination. Every criticism he had made about Marcus Thompson now seemed not just wrong, but potentially suicidal. He was completely dependent on the skills of the man he had insulted, and there was nothing his money or status could do to change that reality. "What are our chances?" Bradley asked Isabella quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. Isabella looked at him for a long moment before answering. "With Captain Thompson flying better than with most pilots, he's landed aircraft in worse conditions than this." "How do you know?" Bradley pressed, desperation making him seek any source of reassurance. "Because I've flown with him for 3 years, Isabella replied. "Because I've seen him handle situations that would have defeated other pilots. Because he's exactly the kind of person you want in the cockpit when everything goes wrong." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the cabin. The pilot Bradley had tried to get removed from the flight was now their only hope of survival. 40 minutes into the emergency, the situation deteriorated further. The weather over Gander was reported as severe, with crosswinds approaching the limits of what the aircraft could safely handle. The remaining engine was showing signs of stress from the increased workload. And most critically, the hydraulic failure had progressed to the point where Marcus was having to manually control the aircraft, using techniques that few commercial pilots had ever practiced in real-world conditions.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Marcus's voice came over the intercom one more time, still calm, but with an undertone that suggested they were approaching the most critical phase of the emergency. We are beginning our descent into Gander. Weather conditions are challenging, and the approach will be steeper and faster than normal due to our mechanical situation. This is going to require everyone to stay calm and follow instructions precisely. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing. Bradley Vincent closed his eyes and, for the first time in years, attempted to pray. But the words wouldn't come. All he could think about was the man in the cockpit. The man whose qualifications he had questioned, whose competence he had doubted, whose character he had insulted, who was now risking his own life to save everyone on board. Please, Bradley whispered to no one in particular. Please let him be good enough. In just a few minutes, Bradley Vincent would discover exactly how good Captain Marcus Thompson really was, and he would learn a lesson about judgment, competence, and character that no amount of corporate success could have taught him. The aircraft was descending through thick clouds toward Gander International Airport at an angle that made every passenger's inner ear scream that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't the gentle, controlled descent of a normal landing approach. This was a controlled fall, the aircraft diving through layers of turbulent air while fighting failures that would have challenged even the most experienced pilots. Bradley Vincent was gripping his armrests so tightly that his knuckles were white and bloodless. His expensive suit was soaked with perspiration, and his usual air of corporate authority had been completely stripped away by the raw terror of being a passenger on a damaged aircraft over the North Atlantic. "How steep is this descent?" Sarah Chen asked her travel blogger's analytical mind, trying to process what she was experiencing even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. "Steeper than normal," Isabella Rodriguez replied from her jump seat, her professional training helping her maintain composure, even as her own experience told her this was an extraordinarily dangerous situation. "Captain Thompson is having to compensate for the hydraulic failure by using gravity and engine power to control our descent rate." The aircraft shuddered again, and through the windows, passengers could see they were now below the cloud layer and approaching a landscape that looked stark and unwelcoming. Gander, Newfoundland stretched below them, a small city surrounded by forests and cold water, their only refuge in an increasingly desperate situation. "There's the airport," James Mitchell said, pointing out the window toward a collection of lights in the growing darkness. "How is he going to land with only one engine?" Before anyone could answer, the intercom crackled to life, and Marcus Thompson's voice filled the cabin. But this time there was something different about the transmission, a clarity and authority that went beyond his previous announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now on final approach to Gander International Airport. Due to our mechanical situation, this will be a non-standard approach requiring advanced techniques. I want everyone to understand that we are trained for exactly these circumstances." Then something unexpected happened. The cabin speakers picked up what sounded like air traffic control communications voices that weren't meant for passenger ears, but were somehow bleeding through the intercom system. "Global 847, this is Gander Tower. Conditions are wind 280 degrees at 35 knots, gusting to 45 visibility, 2 miles in rain and fog. Runway 03 is available, full emergency equipment standing by. Gander Tower, Global Astoni Simti, Cheturdesmit Septini. Understand conditions and emergency equipment. Request priority vectors for single-engine approach." But then the air traffic controller's voice came through with something that made every passenger in the cabin suddenly pay attention. "Global 847, we show you as Captain Thompson. Confirm you're the Blue Angels Thompson from Pensacola." There was a slight pause before Marcus's response, and when it came, his voice carried a new note of confidence that somehow managed to be both humble and absolutely commanding. Affirmative, Gander. Blue Angels lead, though. That feels like a lifetime ago. Could use some of those old skills tonight. Blue Angels. The words hit the cabin like an electric shock. Passengers looked at each other with suddenly widened eyes as they processed what they had just heard. The Blue Angels weren't just military pilots. They were the elite of the elite, the absolute pinnacle of aviation skill and precision. Holy shit, James Mitchell whispered. Did he just say Blue Angels? Sarah Chen's hands were shaking as she grabbed her phone not to record, but to research what she had just heard. The Blue Angels were legendary. The Navy's premier flight demonstration squadron composed of pilots selected from thousands of applicants for their extraordinary skill and precision. Blue Angels. Robert Hayes said to his wife Linda, his voice filled with sudden understanding, "Those are the guys who fly 6 inches apart at 400 miles per hour." Even Bradley Vincent, in his terror-fogged state, understood the significance of what they had just learned. The Blue Angels weren't diversity hires or political appointees. They were the best of the best pilots whose skills were tested and proven at levels that most aviators could only dream of achieving. The air traffic controller's voice came through again, and this time there was unmistakable respect in his tone. "Copy that Blue Angels lead. Be advised weather is deteriorating rapidly. This is going to be a challenging approach. Roger, Gander. I've landed in worse conditions than this. Blue Angels training doesn't forget." Marcus's response was calm and confident, but not arrogant. It was the voice of someone who had been tested under conditions that would break lesser pilots and who had proven his competence when lives depended on precision and skill. Isabella Rodriguez looked directly at Bradley Vincent, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with human compassion. "Now, do you understand?" she asked quietly. "That man in the cockpit isn't just qualified. He's among the most elite pilots in the world." Bradley felt something collapse inside his chest. Not just his prejudices, but his entire worldview about competence and merit and the assumptions he had built his career on. The man he had insulted, the pilot he had tried to get removed from the flight, wasn't just qualified. He was extraordinary. The aircraft banked sharply as Marcus lined up with the runway, fighting crosswinds that were pushing the aircraft sideways and making the approach far more difficult than normal. Through the windows, passengers could see the runway lights appearing and disappearing in the fog, a narrow strip of safety in an increasingly hostile environment. "Gander Tower, Global 847 is configured for emergency landing. Single-engine partial hydraulics heavy fuel load due to inability to dump, requesting crash equipment in position. Global 847 all equipment is standing by. You're cleared to land runway 03. Wind now 290 at 40 knots, gusting to 50. Good luck, Captain." The aircraft was now visibly fighting the wind, rocking back and forth as Marcus used every technique he had learned in his military training to keep them aligned with the runway. The single remaining engine was screaming at maximum power, and the aircraft was descending at an angle that felt impossibly steep. "Brace positions, everyone," Isabella called out. "This is going to be rough." Bradley. Vincent put his head down between his knees, his body shaking with a combination of fear and the crushing realization of how completely wrong he had been. The pilot he had called unqualified was now demonstrating skills that went far beyond anything required for normal commercial aviation. The approach continued with the aircraft fighting every foot of altitude as Marcus used techniques that most commercial pilots had never even seen demonstrated. He was cross-controlling the aircraft using opposite rudder and aileron inputs to maintain alignment while compensating for the failed systems and single-engine operation. "Jesus," James Mitchell muttered, watching through the window as the ground rushed up toward them at what seemed like an impossible angle. How is he keeping us straight? The answer was Blue Angels training. Thousands of hours of precision flying where a single mistake meant death, where pilots learned to control aircraft at the absolute limits of performance, where the difference between survival and disaster was measured in inches and milliseconds. 50 feet above the runway, Marcus pulled off what would later be described by aviation experts as one of the most skillful emergency landings in commercial aviation history. He managed to align the aircraft perfectly with the center line despite crosswinds that should have made landing impossible, touched down with just enough force to ensure the aircraft stayed on the ground, and immediately deployed every available system to bring the damaged plane to a stop. The landing wasn't gentle. It was firm and decisive, the kind of touchdown that announced to everyone aboard that they were now safely on the ground. The aircraft rolled down the runway with emergency vehicles following their lights flashing through the fog as Marcus brought them to a complete stop well short of the runway's end. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the cabin. Then spontaneously applause erupted throughout the aircraft. Not the polite clapping of a normal landing, but the thunderous, emotional applause of people who understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Bradley Vincent sat in his seat, still in the brace position, his body shaking with relief and the crushing weight of his own ignorance. The man he had called unqualified had just demonstrated skills that saved every life on board. The pilot he had assumed was a diversity hire had revealed himself to be among the most elite aviators in the world. "We're alive," Sarah Chen said, tears streaming down her face as she looked around the cabin. "We're actually alive." "Because we had the right pilot," Robert Hayes said, reaching over to unbuckle his wife's seatbelt. "Thank God we had the right pilot." Isabella Rodriguez stood up and looked directly at Bradley Vincent, who was slowly raising his head from the brace position. "Mr. Vincent," she said quietly, "would you like to meet the pilot who just saved your life?" Bradley's eyes filled with tears for the first time since childhood. Not tears of self-pity, but tears of shame and gratitude and the overwhelming realization of how close he had come to losing everything because of his own prejudices. "Yes," he whispered. "I need to tell him. I need to—" But he couldn't finish the sentence because he didn't have words for the magnitude of his error or the depth of his gratitude. All he could do was sit in his seat and wait for the chance to face the man who had proven him wrong in the most dramatic way possible. In the cockpit, Marcus Thompson was completing his post-landing checklist with the same calm professionalism he had displayed throughout the entire emergency. His hands were steady, his voice was calm, and his focus remained entirely on ensuring the safety of everyone aboard. "Nice landing," Captain David Martinez said, his voice filled with admiration. "I've never seen anyone handle crosswinds like that with partial hydraulics." Blue Angels training Marcus replied simply, "Once you've flown formation aerobatics in severe turbulence, commercial emergencies feel manageable." He had no idea that in the cabin behind him, one passenger was experiencing the most profound realization of his adult life, learning that competence and character had nothing to do with the assumptions he had made and everything to do with the qualities he had failed to recognize. The silence that followed the landing was broken only by the sound of emergency vehicles positioning themselves around the aircraft and the collective exhaling of 300 people who had just survived something that felt like a miracle. Inside the cabin, passengers were looking at each other with the kind of shell-shocked relief that comes from confronting mortality and winning. Captain Marcus Thompson's voice came over the intercom one final time, still calm and professional, despite having just pulled off one of the most challenging emergency landings in recent aviation history. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Gander, Newfoundland. We are safely on the ground and emergency crews are conducting routine inspections of the aircraft. Please remain in your seats while we complete our shutdown procedures. I want to thank everyone for following instructions during what I know was a frightening experience. You should all be proud of how you handled a difficult situation." Isabella Rodriguez began moving through the cabin, checking on passengers and preparing for the evacuation procedures that would soon be necessary. But her eyes kept returning to Bradley Vincent, who was still sitting in seat 1, staring straight ahead with an expression she had never seen before. the look of a man whose entire worldview had just been shattered and rebuilt in the span of a few hours. "Mr. Vincent," Isabella said gently, stopping beside his seat. "Are you all right?" Bradley looked up at her with eyes that were red-rimmed and haunted. The arrogant corporate executive who had boarded the flight in Denver was gone, replaced by someone who looked smaller, more vulnerable, and infinitely more human. "No," Bradley said quietly. "I'm not all right. I don't think I'll ever be all right again." James Mitchell, who had unbuckled his seatbelt and was stretching muscles that had been tense with fear for the past hour, overheard the conversation. "You should be grateful to be alive," he said, though his tone was less hostile than it had been earlier. "We all should." "I am grateful," Bradley replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm also... I need to." He struggled to find words for what he was feeling. "I need to apologize. To him. To everyone." Sarah Chen, who had been reviewing the footage she had captured during the flight, looked up from her phone. "You recorded everything that happened before the emergency," she said to Bradley. "Do you understand what that means? Do you understand how this looks?" Bradley nodded slowly, the full implications of his behavior beginning to sink in. "I understand that I humiliated myself. I understand that I said terrible things about a man who just saved my life. I understand that there's probably video of me being..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Being everything I taught my children never to be." The cockpit door opened and Marcus Thompson emerged to inspect the cabin and check on his passengers. He looked tired, the kind of deep fatigue that comes from sustained high-stress concentration, but his bearing remained professional and confident. He moved through the cabin in an orderly way, making eye contact with passengers and offering quiet reassurance to anyone who seemed particularly shaken. When he reached the first-class section, conversations gradually stopped as passengers realized they were in the presence of someone who had just performed what felt like a miracle. The man who had been casually insulted a few hours earlier was now being regarded with something approaching reverence. "How is everyone doing up here?" Marcus asked, his voice warm and genuinely concerned. "I know that was rougher than any of us would have preferred, Captain Thompson," Robert Hayes said, speaking for the group. "I've been flying for 50 years, and I've never experienced anything like what you just did." "That was extraordinary." Marcus's response was characteristically humble. "I had good training, good equipment, and a little bit of luck with the weather. Most importantly, I had passengers who followed instructions and stayed calm under pressure." James Mitchell stood up and extended his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not for anything I said, but for not speaking up more forcefully when someone was questioning your qualifications. What you just did. There aren't many pilots in the world who could have pulled that off." "Thank you," Marcus replied, shaking James's hand. "But honestly, any properly trained pilot would have done the same thing." "It's what we're trained for." "No," Isabella Rodriguez interjected. "It's not. I've been flying for 8 years and I've never seen anyone handle an emergency like that. The way you managed the approach with those crosswinds and partial hydraulics, that was Blue Angels level flying." Marcus smiled slightly at the reference to his military background. "Well, that training does come in handy sometimes." Throughout this exchange, Bradley Vincent remained silent in his seat, watching the conversation but unable to participate. Every word of praise for Marcus's skill was another reminder of how wrong he had been, how his prejudices had blinded him to the competence of the very person who had just saved his life. Finally, Marcus turned his attention to Bradley. His expression was neutral, not hostile, but not particularly warm either. "Mr. Vincent, how are you feeling? Any injuries or concerns?" The simple professional question broke something inside Bradley. Here was the man he had insulted and belittled checking on his welfare with genuine concern despite everything that had happened between them. Captain Thompson, Bradley said, his voice shaking. I owe you. He stopped, unable to continue as emotion overwhelmed him. Marcus pulled the empty seat across the aisle closer and sat down, putting himself at eye level with Bradley. His movement was deliberate and considerate, designed to make the conversation feel private despite the audience. Mr. Vincent, Marcus said quietly, "You've been through a traumatic experience. We all have. Why don't you take a moment to collect yourself?" "You don't understand," Bradley said, tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. "I said terrible things about you. I questioned your qualifications. I tried to get you removed from this flight. And you just—" He gestured helplessly. "You just saved all our lives." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Vincent, I've been dealing with people who make assumptions about my qualifications my entire career. What you said wasn't new, and it wasn't personal. It was ignorance, but it was also fear. It was racism," Bradley said bluntly, the word hanging in the air like an accusation against himself. "Let's call it what it was. I saw a black pilot, and I assumed he wasn't qualified. I was wrong about everything." The admission created a moment of profound silence in the first-class cabin. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something significant, not just an apology, but a genuine reckoning with prejudice and its consequences. "Yes," Marcus said simply, "you were wrong. But you're alive to learn from it, and that's what matters now." Sarah Chen, who had been recording parts of the conversation, spoke up. "Captain Thompson, do you mind if I ask about your background? I mean, we heard the air traffic control conversation about the Blue Angels." Marcus nodded, settling back in his seat. "I flew with the Blue Angels for 2 years after my initial Navy service. Before that, I was a carrier pilot flying FA-18 Chalouies. The Blue Angels taught me precision flying under the most demanding conditions imaginable." "How demanding?" James Mitchell asked, genuinely curious. "Well," Marcus said, "imagine flying 6 inches away from another aircraft at 400 miles per hour, performing aerobatic maneuvers that generate forces your body wasn't designed to handle in front of crowds, where a single mistake means multiple fatalities. It tends to prepare you for situations like tonight." Bradley Vincent listened to this recitation of qualifications with growing horror at his own ignorance. "You were Blue Angels," he said quietly. "Blue Angels pilots are selected from thousands of applicants. They're the best of the best." "They're well trained," Marcus agreed diplomatically. "But more importantly, they're taught to never let ego or personal feelings interfere with the mission. Tonight, the mission was getting everyone safely to the ground. Even me," Bradley said, "even after what I said, what I accused you of." Marcus looked directly at Bradley, his expression serious but not unkind. "Mr. Vincent, I've never been in a situation where I could choose which passengers to save based on how they treated me. Every person on this aircraft was my responsibility, including you." The weight of that statement, the moral authority behind it, hit Bradley like a physical blow. Here was a man who had been insulted and demeaned, who would have been justified in feeling anger or resentment, and who had instead focused entirely on his professional duty to protect everyone under his care. "I don't deserve that," Bradley whispered. "Maybe not?" Marcus agreed quietly. "But deserve doesn't really factor into it. You were a passenger on my aircraft, and that made you my responsibility." Isabella Rodriguez had been watching the exchange with professional fascination. In 8 years of flying, she had seen passengers at their worst and their best, but she had never witnessed such a complete transformation of someone's character in real time. "Mr. Vincent," Isabella said, "what happens next is up to you. You can learn from this experience, or you can go back to your old assumptions. But you should know that everything that happened on this flight is going to be documented and reviewed." The reminder brought Bradley back to the practical reality of his situation. Sarah Chen had recorded his racist comments. Other passengers had witnessed his behavior. In the age of social media and viral videos, his prejudices were about to become public knowledge. "I understand," Bradley said, "and I deserve whatever consequences come from this. But right now, all I care about is saying thank you to the man who saved my life despite everything I put him through." Marcus Thompson stood up, preparing to continue his passenger welfare checks. "Mr. Vincent, I accept your gratitude. More importantly, I hope you'll remember this experience the next time you're tempted to make assumptions about someone's qualifications based on what they look like." As Marcus moved away to check on other passengers, Bradley Vincent was left alone with the full weight of his transformation. The man who had boarded the flight as a confident, prejudiced corporate executive was now forced to confront not just his own ignorance, but the broader implications of how he had lived his life and treated other people. Sarah Chen approached his seat as the evacuation process began. "Mr. Vincent, I recorded most of what happened today. I'm planning to post it online. Do you have anything you'd like to say?" Bradley looked up at her, his face streaked with tears and his expensive suit rumpled from the emergency landing. "Yes," he said. "I want to say that I was wrong about everything. I want to say that Captain Thompson is a hero who saved all our lives. And I want to say that anyone who makes the same assumptions I made is not just morally wrong. They're dangerously stupid." As emergency crews prepared to evacuate the passengers to the terminal, Bradley Vincent began the long process of understanding how profoundly his life was about to change. The video of his racist comments and Marcus Thompson's heroic response would soon be seen by millions of people, but that was just the beginning of the consequences he would face. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that his assumptions about merit and qualifications weren't just wrong. They had nearly prevented him from recognizing the extraordinary competence of the very person who had saved his life. 6 months after Flight 847's emergency landing in Gander, the world had changed for everyone involved, but perhaps no one more dramatically than Bradley Vincent. The video that Sarah Chen posted, showing his racist assumptions followed by Marcus Thompson's heroic landing, had been viewed over 50 million times, spawning congressional hearings on discrimination in transportation federal legislation, protecting transportation workers from passenger bias, and a complete transformation of how airlines handled discriminatory behavior. Bradley sat in a small coffee shop in Newark, New Jersey, far from the executive boardrooms where he had once wielded power. Vintech Industries had terminated him within 48 hours of the video going viral. His wife had filed for divorce after the public humiliation became unbearable, and his reputation in the corporate world had been permanently destroyed. He was now working as a consultant for small businesses, making a fraction of his former salary. But something unexpected had happened during his fall from grace. For the first time in his adult life, Bradley Vincent was learning to see people as they actually were, rather than as his prejudices told him they should be. His phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Thompson Coffee, meeting still on for 3 p.m. "Looking forward to our conversation." Bradley smiled slightly, a genuine expression rather than the corporate mask he had worn for decades. Over the past 6 months, he had written dozens of letters to Marcus, apologizing for his behavior and trying to make amends. Most surprising of all, Marcus had responded with grace, and even agreed to meet periodically to discuss Bradley's efforts to understand and overcome his prejudices. "Still hard to believe he's willing to help me," Bradley thought as he walked to the meeting location. Marcus was already waiting when Bradley arrived at the small restaurant near Newark Airport. He was in civilian clothes rather than his captain's uniform, but he still carried himself with the quiet authority that had been so evident during the emergency. Bradley, Marcus said, standing to shake hands. "You look better, more relaxed." "Thank you for meeting with me," Bradley replied. "And thank you for..." Well, for everything you've done to help me understand what I was really doing with my assumptions about people. Over the past 6 months, Marcus had used his sudden fame as a platform for change rather than personal profit. He had become the face of a new federal initiative called the Thompson Act, which required comprehensive anti-bias training for all transportation workers and established reporting for discriminatory behavior by passengers. He had also founded the Precision Flight Academy, a program specifically designed to recruit and train pilots from underrepresented communities. "How's the consulting work going?" Marcus asked as they sat down. "It's humbling," Bradley admitted. "I'm working with small business owners who are doing amazing things with limited resources. I'm learning that everything I thought I knew about evaluating talent was wrong. I was so focused on credentials and appearances that I missed actual competence." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's something I've been thinking about a lot since our experience together. The assumptions people make about qualifications usually say more about their own limitations than about the people they're judging. I've been following your academy," Bradley said. "The graduation rates are incredible. You're proving that talent exists everywhere if people are just given the opportunity." The Precision Flight Academy had become a model for how to identify and develop exceptional pilots regardless of their background or appearance. Marcus had recruited instructors from the Blue Angels Navy test pilot programs and commercial aviation's most experienced captains. The graduates were already earning reputations as exceptionally skilled pilots. "We're just providing opportunities," Marcus said modestly. The talent was always there. Bradley was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Marcus, I want you to know that what happened on that flight changed everything about how I see the world. Not just about race, but about merit, about competence, about what really matters when people's lives are at stake." "I'm glad," Marcus replied. "But what matters now is what you do with that understanding. I'm trying to make amends in whatever ways I can," Bradley said. "I've been volunteering with organizations that combat workplace discrimination. I've been speaking to business groups about the cost of prejudice, not just the moral cost, but the practical cost of missing talented people because of assumptions." This was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the entire incident. Bradley Vincent had become an unlikely advocate for diversity and inclusion, using his own experience as a cautionary tale about how prejudice could blind successful people to the competence that surrounded them. "The speaking engagements have been challenging," Bradley continued. "Admitting your own ignorance in front of corporate executives isn't comfortable. But if it helps even one person recognize their own biases before they make the mistakes I made, it's worth the embarrassment." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Bradley with the analytical eye of a pilot assessing conditions. "You know, when I first became a commercial pilot, I expected to encounter prejudice. What I didn't expect was how satisfying it would be to watch people like you discover that their assumptions were wrong." "Satisfying?" Bradley asked, surprised. "Not in a vindictive way," Marcus clarified. "But there's something powerful about watching someone realize that they've been limiting themselves by limiting how they see others. When you opened your mind to the possibility that your assumptions were wrong, you didn't just become less prejudiced. You became more capable of recognizing actual excellence." This was the lesson that Bradley had been learning in his consulting work. By abandoning his preconceptions about what competence looked like, he had become dramatically better at identifying talented people and effective strategies. His small business clients were succeeding in part because he was finally seeing their capabilities clearly. "I have something to tell you," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. "I got a call from the Secretary of Transportation yesterday. They want to implement the Thompson Act nationwide and expand it to other transportation sectors. They're also interested in making the Precision Flight Academy model a federal program." Bradley felt a surge of genuine pride for Marcus's success, an emotion that would have been impossible for his old self to experience. "That's incredible. You're going to change the entire industry." "We're going to change it," Marcus corrected. Your willingness to speak publicly about your own experience has been crucial in getting corporate support for these initiatives. When CEOs hear from someone like you about the business cost of prejudice, they listen. As their conversation concluded and they prepared to leave, Marcus turned to Bradley with a final observation. You know that flight to London changed both of us. You learned that your assumptions about competence were wrong. I learned that even the most prejudiced person can change if they're willing to confront the truth about themselves. Bradley Vincent walked away from that meeting carrying something he had never possessed during his years of corporate success. The knowledge that his greatest achievement wasn't building a company or accumulating wealth, but learning to see people as they actually were, rather than as his prejudices told him they should be. 6 months after nearly dying in an aircraft emergency, Bradley had discovered that the most important lesson wasn't about flying or heroism. It was about recognizing that true competence, real excellence, and genuine character could not be judged by appearance, background, or any of the superficial markers he had relied on throughout his career. The man who had insulted a hero had become, in his own small way, someone who was finally worthy of the respect of people like Captain Marcus Thompson. Sometimes the universe has a way of teaching us lessons we never knew we needed to learn. Bradley Vincent thought his money and status gave him the right to judge others, but he discovered that real judgment comes from recognizing excellence wherever it exists. Captain Marcus Thompson didn't just save lives that night. He saved souls, including that of a man who had spent decades blind to the talent and character that surrounded him. What do you think? Should Bradley have faced even more consequences for his behavior? Or was his transformation enough? Have you ever had an experience that completely changed how you see other people? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you think about your own assumptions, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because sometimes the people we're quickest to judge are the very ones we need the most. If this story of karma, justice, and redemption moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Your support helps us bring you more stories about courage, dignity, and the power of seeing people for who they really are. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest stories about real heroes and life-changing moments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.